The Indian economy is at the threshold of a major structural shift, moving towards an 8% GDP growth rate on a sustained basis. During a period between May 2022 and February 2024, the Reserve Bank of India raised the repo rate by 2.5% to 6.5% to bring inflation under control. It has poised these repo rate hikes since then. Moreover, the RBI Governor Shaktikanta Das has highlighted that the healthy economic growth rate gives RBI the space to single-mindedly and unambiguously focus on inflation. The taming of inflation will also lead to a spurt in discretionary consumer spending and help the economy further. The governor believes the retail inflation is likely to dip to 4.5% in the next fiscal year, which would significantly strengthen the economy. The financial system, with the RBI's focus, remains actively disinflationary. All right, let's start our conversation. Dr. Sharad Kohli, here's after 8 times having the repo rate constant, unchanged at 6.5%, there is now a hint that is being given by the RBI governor that there may in fact be a rise in the repo rate the next time it is changed.
Well, Megha, I think it's always good to be optimistic, first of all, and I place on record my appreciation for RBI Governor Shaktikant Das for being optimistic. He's very conservative at times, but this time he's being optimistic. But I foresee as an economist some challenges here, because to have this rate on a sustainable basis may be slightly tougher than what probably we can imagine. And here are the challenges. First challenge is the geopolitical challenge, because we see these things erupting in West Asia, in the Korean Peninsula between China and America. There are a lot of eruptions happening around the world. And it's just a matter, and we keep hearing the word nuclear more often than not. We keep hearing the word World War III more often than not. So I think these challenges, this is a very, very big challenge as far as, if you ask me, as far as my analysis goes, because it might disrupt the supply chain, leading to complications. That's the first. My second challenge is, I think a few days ago when the Monetary Policy Committee made its announcements, the RBI governor himself said that the headline food inflation is still a bit stubborn. It's been a cause of concern, and this has been across the world, vegetables, you take pulses, you take fruits, some of the other, basically the kitchen thali as such has been a matter of concern, and that inflation has been the toughest to overcome, which is why the inflation rate is still beyond the ideal rate of 4% where RBI wants it to be. So I think with the monsoons knocking at our doors, and monsoon has mostly spread to major part of the country now, I think the monsoon's progress will be very, very, I would say, anticipated, because if the monsoons are too many, if there are floods, then again, there'll be food disruptions. So that is the second biggest challenge. The third biggest challenge, which I foresee, is, the political instability that we will see with regard to, the parliamentary functioning, because the opposition is going to disrupt the parliament proceedings, which I am anticipating, and the lack of cooperation from the states where the NDA government is not there. If they don't work in a synchronized manner, the growth engine cannot be pushed the way it was. Although all the growth engines right now are firing well, he spoke about that. Exports are doing well, manufacturing, services, agriculture, they're all doing well. But on a sustainable basis, I think it's going to be a tough call, Megha, is my first reaction to what you said.
Okay. I also have with me Jayji Bhattacharya. How do you interpret the statement that has been made by the RBI governor? And there have been predictions, the forecasts that have been made by international agencies, by the IMF as well, of India inching towards the 8% GDP growth rate.
Yeah, I think the qualifier will be ceteris paribus. That is, all things being equal, we'll definitely have an 8% growth rate. But I'll resonate with all the issues that Dr. Sharad Kohli mentioned. And I'll amplify on the issue of climate change, which is really not under the control of either the government or the RBI. And I think those are challenges that we'll be facing. But if things are as it is normally, then if there is normal monsoon, there is no floods, there is no floods in the rest of the world, because the demand will diminish in the global supply chain if other countries and other nations and other economies face the climate change issues, in addition to all the geopolitical issues that are going on. Now, fortunately, I believe that the tailwind for geopolitical disturbance is kind of waning because many of the conflicting nations are now getting tired of waging the war. So hopefully there will be some semblance of geopolitical stability as we move forward. If you look at it only from an India perspective, then it's absolutely great news all over.
Yeah.
It's not just managing inflation; it's also the fact that there are a significant number of initiatives that are being taken by the government in terms of rolling out, port-based cities, in terms of highways, infrastructure, everything that is needed to really push for an economy, create the demand, and therefore create the supplies that needs to lead to the growth that we're talking about. So it's great news from an internal perspective, but clearly there are many factors that we can't have control over.
Mitali Nikore, how about you? You know, when the RBI governor comes out and says that he's confident that there is going to be sustained growth at 8%, and he does not have to worry about it, and therefore even if he tinkers with the repo rate, which has remained constant for the last 8 times, it is not going to impact how the country, how the economy grows.
So, hi, Megha, and, I completely agree with, Dr. Kohli, actually, that, at this point in time, when we look at the economic fundamentals, of our economy, there are certain sectors which are doing phenomenally well. And those are the sectors which give the RBI governor this confidence that we're talking about. When we look at the manufacturing sector, it has registered a 10% growth rate last year in FY23. Which is something that has not been seen for at least a decade. We have not seen manufacturing sector grow this fast. The second thing which gives the RBI governor this confidence is when we look at the services sector growth. Certain services sector like financial sector, banking sector, construction services also, real estate, performing absolutely phenomenally, in the last year or 2 years post-COVID. So, the confidence comes from these two areas. But as Jayjeev rightly pointed out, when we cannot ignore the specter of climate change, right? We are not living in that era anymore where we are not going to see climatic events. We are going to see climatic events. We have to plan for them. And we have to invest in climate resilient infrastructure. So in order for those investments to become affordable, in order for infrastructure investment paths to continue, we talked about port-led cities. It's not only port-led cities. We have to invest in social infrastructure. We have to invest in healthcare and education. We have to invest in, care economy and care infrastructure for female labor force participation. All of this requires the availability of patient capital at cheaper rates. And India is now going to be joining the JP Morgan's Emerging Economy Index. So, in that context, the repo rate increases, whether they happen or not, the confidence is not ill-founded. But the actual monetary conditions to be present for a repo rate increase, in my view as an economist, at this point are not present because of the need for cheaper capital at this point. If we increase our interest rate at this point, then domestic borrowing will become more expensive, driving up inflation a little more than what can be controlled beyond even the 6% mark.
Professor Nalapat, as a layman, talking about inflation, and it has been a point of concern that the opposition has taken up during the entire election campaigning cycle as well to attack the government. If I take a look at the inflation figures in the past, 2024, it stands at 4.6%, 2023 4.38%, 2022 it was 6.65%, and then we take a look at 2018 where it was 3.41%, and then further down in 2012 it was 10.05%, 2010 it's 9.37%, 2008 9.09%. So we have seen the economy going through these troughs and the valleys and the troughs. How important does it become for a consumer, for a citizen of the country, to have when we have a lower inflation rate, it impacts the households tremendously. Like I said, it gives a point for the opposition to attack the government. And how integral is it for our economy to be, at a stage which is, if I say near perfect or ideal?
Well, Megha, I'd like to point out that yes, it's very important to control inflation. And yes, despite COVID, despite the shock of the Ukraine war, now the Gaza war, despite all these shocks, this government has succeeded in doing quite well, exceptionally well, where the economy is concerned. There's no doubt about that. But I would definitely go with what Sharath and Mitali are saying, and saying that low interest rates are important. Why? Because we still have a huge trade deficit. We have a deficit with those countries which are effectively charging their enterprises zero or even negative interest rates. I'm talking about China, for example, where you have an enormous amount of hidden and open subsidies so that they can flood the world, including India, with their exports. We must increase our exports to ensure that the balance of payments is brought in line with the other economic fundamentals. And secondly, I again agree with Sharath when he points out that interest rate, the weapon of interest rate in the Reserve Bank, it has an impact across the whole spectrum of industry. It has an impact across the whole spectrum of production. And ironically, when you raise the interest rates, it tends to raise prices because those higher interest rates are more than passed on by individuals to the consumer. So it results in a higher interest rate. I think the RBI did very well in holding the repo rate steady. I think we should not look at this 8% as enough. I think the RBI governor should be more ambitious. He should aim at 10%, 12%. And when he is convinced the economy is entered on a double-digit growth track, that is probably the time when he can consider this kind of a rate hike, but definitely not now. The economy is taking off into double-digit growth, and a rise in interest rates will only slow that takeoff down, and ironically, as I said, it will increase inflation.
Okay. Dr. Sharath Kohli, this conundrum of increasing the repo rate in a bid to reduce inflation, but the contrary being achieved, how do we correct this?
Well, if you see the global scenario, as Professor Nalapat rightly pointed out, what China is doing, and we saw Europe, trying to bring down the rates, and the American Fed has also indicated probably somewhere towards the end of this year, we will see the rate reversals happening. So India will have to follow suit, for that matter. If you're looking at 6.5% as of now, with inflation being at about between 4.5% and 5%, there is a certain margin to bring down the interest rate. But if you look at RBI Governor's statement, Megha, he also said that the credit growth is outpacing the savings. I mean, the credit growth has been phenomenal. So even at these high interest rates, a very surprising thing which has happened is because the undercurrent in the economy is so strong as of now that people are willing to borrow even at higher interest rates because they're able to generate sales and consumption is happening. Consumption, maybe in rural consumption, there are some gaps here and there, but urban consumption is doing pretty well. So I think it's as you said, it's a conundrum. I mean, it's a mixed kind of phenomena which is happening: high interest rates, high credit growth, mixed consumption. So as I said, there are four engines of the economy. The government investment is happening, which is the public investment is happening. Private investment is just about picking up. I won't say private investment is going great guns. Consumption, urban consumption is good. Rural consumption, there are gaps here and there. Exports are doing fairly well, where the world economic growth has been projected at about 3.2%. We are more than double that. So even if you're not able to sustain 8%, we are able to sustain, say, 7% or 6.5% to 7%. Even then, we'll be double the pace of the world economic growth. So, even if we have to compromise 100 percentile points here and there, it really, really would not matter. More important is that all engines should keep firing, and that will all be subject to the challenges which I mentioned, Dr. Jayjeet mentioned, Mitali mentioned, and Professor Nalapat also highlighted. these challenges, the geopolitical challenge, the monsoon or climate change challenge, the political factor, I consider is very important, because the very first day of the parliament, we saw uproar happening while the swearing in was happening. So I think political calmness, a constructive opposition is required to push the country forward, because there are still states which are governed by non-NDA government. So if they don't want to implement the policies the reforms being done by the central government, which are on the state list, what happens? I mean, those parts of the country will not go. So I think it's going to be a very tough call going ahead. However, at this point, I completely agree with Dr. Jayji that at this point, if other things remain constant, we are on an absolute marvelous track, and we are a matter of envy for rest of the world. It's an ideal model of how a 140 crore economy, which was once amongst the fragile five, has suddenly come to a level where it's amongst the top five and quickly marching towards being the world's third largest economy, Megha.
Okay. Let's also get in a word from Jayjeet about can inflation be corrected by market forces without RBI having to intervene?
Market forces are very difficult to control and predict. There are multiple factors that leads to the market forces playing out. And let's just understand what is the challenge of a monetary policy, which is what the RBI is really talking about.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the inflation rate for 2024, it was roughly about 4.5%. What is the repo rate? The repo rate was about 6.5%. So the real interest rate that is being charged is about 2%, which is roughly what any other place in any other world is also charging. Roughly, 1 to 2% is the real interest rate that is being charged. So it's not that, that our interest rates are really very high when you compare it with the real interest rate or, post-inflation adjustment. If we become too cautious about the, interest rate and we try and bring it down any further, what will happen is more money will get pumped in and therefore inflation will go up. Now, what is the problem with inflation? And what is the right thing and what's the right balance to do? Now, with inflation, what happens is that those who are the most vulnerable sections of the society, including those who have retired and they've got their savings, inflation is really a tax on them. Because if you've got 1,000 rupees in the bank, post-inflation after 1 year, if there is 10% inflation, the real money that you have in your bank becomes 900 rupees. So you've lost 100 rupees in the bank because of inflation.
Right.
Similarly, if your poor person is buying, potatoes at whatever 50 rupees, after 1 year of 10% inflation, it will become 55 rupees. So the person really starts losing money. There has to be a fine balance between this issue where you're taxing people through inflation versus the growth, because as Professor Nalapad rightly pointed out, growth is extremely important. So if you start making money expensive, therefore, the entrepreneurs will not be able to borrow money and indulge in entrepreneurial activities, which leads to growth happening. So the job of the RBI is really to balance between these two and bring stability to the economy. If we indulge again in a loose monetary policy, which is what many of the economies in the world have done, it has led to a complete havoc happening. And I know that is what has happened in UK for that matter last year. Japan kind of faced that in a way. And the good news really is that as we stand today post 2024, and I don't think many people have caught that, we are really the number 4th economy. We are no more the number 5 economy. We are joined number 4 with Japan. We have, stealthily reached that level. I don't know why nobody has picked it up. And it's largely because of very good managing of the monetary policies, along with all the other initiatives that have been taken by the government.
Okay. Then Mitali, would it be true to say that today when we have a per capita expenditure and per capita income that has increased, does it balance out the inflation that is seen in the market?
So I think, Megha, of course, I think that is correct. But I would like to bring our attention to another point, which I think Professor Kohli and Dr. Bhattacharya also talked about, which is around growth, but also around job creation. One thing which we need as an economy, which we have not managed to achieve to the extent that we need to achieve, is the generation of good quality employment for the youth of this country. Now, what we are seeing on an everyday basis these days, right? We are seeing protests, we are seeing exam, cancellations, we are seeing that entire issue of scams coming up in competitive exams. But I think the core question becomes, why is it that so many youth of our country are even dependent on these competitive exams? This is because if we have sufficient investment from the private sector, exactly as Dr. Kohli was saying, if you have cheaper capital available, then only will the private sector, be it in the manufacturing space where we are starting to see that growth, or in the services space, actually come in and invest. Now, the other area, the other sector in which we need to see private sector investment, which we have never been able to broach, is the agriculture sector. We need to have more and more private sector companies come in and invest in climate resilient agricultural practices, because otherwise the risk on the farmers, who are 50% of our economy's, workforce, is in agriculture. 75% of the female workforce is in agriculture. So if we don't have sufficient investment from companies in agriculture, food processing, and then agri-logistics to bring that food to marketplaces, we will continue to see that inflationary impact, right? And we also have to invest in cold storage facilities, because these cold storage facilities are actually what bring down food inflation. So all in all, I would just say that if we look at the overall macroeconomic conditions, we have to look at how these impact employment as well.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. Professor Madhav Nalapat, as Mitali said, wastage of food, wastage of power as well. I think we waste about almost 50% of our energy production. We waste almost 50% of our food production. Does that if these savings are done, will this allow for these inflationary trends to also drop down, and the overall robustness of the economy will also be positively impacted?
Megha, you're quite right. And may I point out that millions and millions of tons of food were being wasted in the past. They were rotting in godowns. And today, 800 million people, citizens of India, are being given food. Now, some people say, oh my God, that's an expenditure. No, it's an investment in the future. Because as Mitali correctly said, the youth, they need an investment. They need an investment in nourishing food. They need an investment in better education. And most importantly, they need more opportunities. I quite agree. Now, there are states where the agitation regarding competitive examinations is very low, because in these states, the private sector has been hiring significantly. The growth rate of these sectors is much more, of these states, is much more than the growth rate of other states where the private sector has not really expanded that significantly. So I'd like to say that what this government has done in feeding 800 million people is not expenditure but investment. But having said that, I'd also like to point out, it's much easier to create chaos on the road, a street protest, or multiple issues if the youth are unemployed. If you're employed, then you have no time for any of these things. Even now, when I saw this agitation going on about the farmers' agitation, and I saw for myself that actually all the fields in Punjab were being tilled. Those individuals who were not needed to till the farms, they're the ones who are agitating.
Yeah.
In other words, the ones who are not doing farming at all were talking about the farmers. The farmers are actually farming. So jobs is very important. For that, double-digit growth is very, very important. The Modi government is on track to achieve that rate of growth. And until that is achieved, frankly, none of us should basically, say, okay, we are fine. No, the Modi government is on track, and we have to ensure in the next year or so, double-digit growth is raised, and it is possible. But this is what I think the RBI needs to keep in mind. The reality that jobs are a source of social cohesion, as well as social tension. And if you want to avoid social tension, you must generate more jobs for the youth.
Absolutely. All right, I'm out of time, but I thank all of you for joining me on the telecast and sharing your views on this very important subject.